Imagine being a single mother, working day and night just to provide for your kids, only to wake up one morning and find a letter on your door demanding hundreds of dollars in fines just because your children left their toys outside. This isn't a crime. It's childhood. But the HOA didn't see it that way. What started as a simple pile of toys turned into a brutal fight between a mother's love and a neighborhood's rules. And when the community finally stepped in, everything changed. On the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood stood a small two-bedroom house, its paint slightly weathered but its front yard alive with the kind of joy only children could create. The grass bore marks of summer play, tiny footprints pressed into the soil, scattered chalk drawings fading under the sun, and the occasional colorful ball that had rolled into the flower bed. This was the home of Sarah, a single mother of two young children who juggled her long work hours with raising them on her own. Her modest yard might not have been the neatest on the block, but it was filled with laughter, the smell of bubble soap, and the innocence of play. For Sarah, the yard was more than grass and flowers. It was the safe haven where her children spent their afternoons after school. She couldn't afford fancy vacations, and she didn't have time to take them to amusement parks every weekend. But she made sure her kids had a space where their imaginations could run wild. Plastic trucks, skipping ropes, a small tricycle, and a toy kitchen set lined one side of the porch, giving the house an atmosphere of warmth and childhood energy. But in the eyes of the Homeowners Association, the toys were an offense. The HOA, obsessed with uniform lawns and picture-perfect appearances, saw Sarah's front yard not as a symbol of family and love, but as clutter. They claimed it violated community guidelines that demanded all outdoor spaces must be free of obstructions and personal items when not in immediate use. It was a rule originally meant for trash cans and gardening equipment, but under the rigid leadership of the HOA president, a stern woman named Margaret, it became a weapon against Sarah. The first warning arrived in the form of a thin, white envelope tucked into her mailbox. Sarah found it after a long day at work, her hands still tired from typing and her mind heavy with bills that needed paying. Inside, the letter carried an official tone that felt cold and unforgiving. It said she had 7 days to remove unauthorized items from her yard. If she didn't comply, fines would begin to accumulate. At first, Sarah tried to brush it off. She reasoned that perhaps the letter was a mistake, maybe intended for someone else. After all, toys in a yard seemed harmless. Her children weren't disturbing anyone. They were simply being children. But within a week, another notice came, harsher in tone, demanding immediate action. The letter threatened a $100 fine for every week the toys remained outside. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she read it. She had barely enough money to cover rent, groceries, and the constant needs of her children. Any extra expense would pull her closer to the edge of financial disaster. Still, she couldn't bring herself to take away the small joys her children had. The toys represented more than playthings. They were symbols of a childhood she fought hard to protect despite her circumstances. The HOA's obsession didn't stop with letters. Margaret, the president, began patrolling the neighborhood more aggressively, walking past Sarah's house with a clipboard, writing notes, and frowning at the sight of the toys. Sometimes Sarah would catch her shaking her head disapprovingly, as though a few plastic playthings were an act of rebellion against the entire community. Neighbors began whispering. Some shrugged it off as typical HOA overreach, while others started avoiding Sarah, unwilling to be caught on the wrong side of Margaret's authority. One afternoon, Sarah returned home to find a bright orange sticker on her front door. It was a violation notice posted publicly, making sure everyone in the neighborhood could see her failure to comply. The embarrassment stung more than the threat of fines. She could feel the judgment of neighbors as they drove by, their eyes lingering on the notice like it was a scarlet letter pinned to her house. That night, Sarah sat alone in her kitchen, the children asleep upstairs, their toys neatly stacked on the porch outside. She felt trapped. Should she strip her yard of every reminder of childhood, leaving it bare to satisfy rules that seemed designed for sterile perfection? Or should she stand her ground, knowing full well she was inviting financial penalties she could not afford? The conflict gnawed at her. She thought about the sacrifices she already made every day, skipping meals so her kids could eat, taking double shifts to afford their school supplies, and staying up late to sew loose hems on their clothes instead of buying new ones. And now, on top of all that, the HOA wanted to punish her for letting her children leave toys outside, as if the sight of innocence was somehow offensive. By the end of the week, the fines began. A notice informed her that $100 had been added to her account. Each passing week added more. What started as a nuisance quickly grew into a financial nightmare. The letters became more threatening, suggesting that continued violations could lead to liens on her property. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the HOA wasn't just trying to enforce rules, they were trying to crush her into submission. Word spread across the neighborhood, and whispers grew louder. Some neighbors began to sympathize. They saw Sarah walking her kids to school every morning carrying bags heavier than her frame and returning late at night still wearing her work uniform. They noticed her children, happy despite having less than most, playing with toys that were simple but loved. Slowly, some began questioning whether the HOA had gone too far. Sarah didn't know it yet, but her struggle was becoming a story of principle, one that would soon unite more than just her household. The toys in her yard, once dismissed as clutter, were becoming symbols of defiance, resilience, and the right of a family to live with dignity. But for now, she sat alone, staring at the mounting fines, her mind racing with fear and anger. The battle lines had been drawn, and Sarah was standing on one side, alone against the powerful HOA. What she didn't realize was that the community, though silent for now, was watching closely, and soon they would no longer remain on the sidelines. The orange sticker still clung to her front door that night, flapping slightly in the wind. It wasn't just a violation notice anymore. It was a declaration of war from the HOA. And Sarah, though weary and afraid, was about to discover that she wasn't as alone as she thought. The letter sat on the kitchen counter like an unwanted guest, its sharp black print glaring against the white paper. Maria picked it up again, though she had already read every word a dozen times since it was slid into her mailbox the day before. The Homeowners Association had issued her a formal notice of violation, citing unsightly items left in common view. Those unsightly items were nothing more than her children's toys, a plastic tricycle, a bright red wagon, a small bin of sidewalk chalk, and a basketball that rarely stayed still for long. To Maria, they were the signs of a home filled with life, energy, and the innocence of childhood. But to the HOA, they were apparently an offense worthy of punishment. The notice demanded that she remove the toys from her yard immediately or face a fine. The deadline was 3 days. If she failed to comply, the HOA warned that she would incur a penalty of $100 for every day the violation remained. Maria stared at the letter, her heart pounding. For a single mother trying to make ends, meet $100 a day was an unbearable weight. Her paycheck was already stretched thin between rent, groceries, and school supplies for her kids. The thought of such fines accumulating was terrifying. Her children were too young to understand the storm brewing. That morning, as Maria prepared breakfast, they laughed and played in the living room, their toys scattered like tiny jewels across the carpet. Their joy was unshaken by the looming threat outside. Maria didn't want them to feel the tension she carried, so she forced a smile and tried to carry on as if everything were normal. But deep down, anxiety gnawed at her. She wondered how something as simple as toys could turn into such a serious battle. Why did the HOA seem to lack even the smallest shred of compassion? As the deadline approached, Maria attempted to reason with herself. Maybe the HOA had rules she wasn't fully aware of. Maybe this was standard practice and not personal. But when she walked through the neighborhood, she couldn't help but notice other homes with bicycles leaning against fences, soccer balls left on porches, and even gardening tools resting in yards. No one else seemed to be under the same microscope. Her house stood out, not because it was messy, but because it belonged to a single mother with limited resources, and perhaps that made her an easy target. The unfairness of it all burned inside her. By the third day, Maria still hadn't removed the toys. She couldn't bear to hide away the very things that brought her children joy. To take them away would be to steal part of their childhood, all because a group of neighbors decided to value rigid rules over kindness. She left the toys outside, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the HOA would show mercy or overlook the so-called violation. But mercy never came. On the morning of the fourth day, another letter appeared in her mailbox. This one was shorter, colder, and far more devastating. It informed her that she was now officially being fined $100 for non-compliance, effective immediately. The letter also warned that continued defiance would result in escalating penalties and potential legal action. Maria sat down on her porch steps, the letter trembling in her hands. She felt as though the world was closing in around her, and there was no way out. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some of Maria's neighbors shook their heads in disbelief, whispering about how unfair the HOA was being. Others avoided the topic altogether, unwilling to get involved in what they considered someone else's problem. But a handful of families felt a deep anger on Maria's behalf. They had children of their own, and they knew how impossible it would be to keep every toy hidden away at all times. They began to see the HOA's actions not as enforcement of rules, but as harassment aimed at a vulnerable mother. One evening, as Maria gathered her kids inside after a long day, she noticed her neighbor Karen from across the street watching, with a disapproving glare. Karen was a longtime member of the HOA board, known for her strict interpretations of the rules and her sharp tongue during meetings. She was the one who had filed the complaint about Maria's yard. Karen believed that the neighborhood should project a pristine image at all times, and to her, the sight of children's toys scattered outside was an embarrassment. Maria felt a shiver of dread run down her spine as their eyes briefly met. It was clear now, this wasn't just about rules, this was personal. The fines began to stack up. By the end of the first week, Maria owed $700. The HOA's letters grew more aggressive, threatening liens against her home and additional legal consequences if she didn't comply. Maria's stomach twisted with stress. She began losing sleep, lying awake at night imagining how quickly her situation could spiral out of control. Would she lose her home? Would her children be forced to move because of a few toys left in the yard? And yet, amidst the fear, Maria discovered a flicker of hope. A group of neighbors, families who had grown tired of Karen's heavy-handed tactics, knocked on her door one evening. They offered words of support and quietly promised that she wouldn't have to face this fight alone. They began to talk among themselves, discussing ways to stand up against the HOA's unfair treatment. The seeds of resistance were being planted, though Maria couldn't yet see how powerful they would become. Still, the weight of the fines grew heavier each day. The HOA seemed determined to break her spirit, to force her into submission through intimidation and financial ruin. Maria clung to her children as her source of strength. She reminded herself that she wasn't just fighting for toys, she was fighting for their right to live in a home where laughter and play were not treated as crimes. She was fighting for dignity, for fairness, and for the future of her family. As the sun set on another long day, Maria folded the latest letter from the HOA and set it aside. Her children were asleep in their beds, their toys still resting quietly in the yard. She stepped outside and gazed at them, her resolve hardening. The HOA might control the rules, but they would not control her spirit. She was ready to endure the battle ahead, no matter how brutal it became. The stage was set. The fines had begun, and the community was slowly stirring awake to the injustice unfolding before their eyes. The following week unfolded like a storm cloud inching slowly over the neighborhood, heavy with the promise of thunder. For Rachel, every morning began with dread. Her children's laughter, once carefree, now echoed under the weight of unspoken tension. Even a simple game of catch in the yard carried the risk of attracting another complaint from the HOA. Each knock at her door set her heart racing, unsure whether it was a friendly neighbor or yet another delivery of fines wrapped in stern language. But something had begun to shift. Among her neighbors, there was a growing murmur of discontent. The HOA had long wielded its power with rigid authority, dictating the smallest details of how lawns should be trimmed and what decorations could hang from porches. Many had complied silently, afraid to attract unwanted attention. Yet Rachel's situation pierced deeper than lawn care or paint colors. It touched something raw and universal, the innocence of children and the right of a family to live without harassment. Evelyn, the elderly neighbor who had once stood up for Rachel, became a catalyst for quiet conversations. On her evening walks, she spoke in hushed tones to other residents, recounting how the HOA had fined Rachel for something as harmless as a child's toy truck left near the porch. The absurdity of it all ignited anger that had long simmered beneath the surface. Parents whispered among themselves, exchanging stories of times they too had been unfairly targeted. Each story added fuel to the slow-burning fire of resistance. Rachel, however, remained unaware of the storm brewing in her defense. She focused on protecting her children from the stress, keeping their routines as normal as possible. She picked up the toys more diligently, scanning the yard with anxious eyes, terrified that one forgotten ball might spark another wave of trouble. The joy of watching her kids play freely was now replaced with a constant sense of monitoring, as though her own home had become a stage under surveillance. The HOA board, led by its president, Ms. Whitfield, carried on as though the community's unrest were invisible. Whitfield reveled in her role, often patrolling the neighborhood with a clipboard in hand, jotting down violations with mechanical precision. Her eyes lingered on Rachel's home with particular sharpness, as if every minor detail offended her sense of order. To Whitfield, rules were not guidelines but absolutes. Exceptions were weaknesses, and leniency was a threat to control. But beneath Whitfield's authority, cracks were beginning to show. Board meetings grew tense as whispers of disapproval crept into the discussions. Some members, once loyal, started to question whether the relentless pursuit of compliance had crossed a moral line. They spoke cautiously, fearful of Whitfield's wrath. But the seeds of dissent were planted. Meanwhile, Rachel received another notice, this one more severe. The fine had doubled, and the language threatened legal action if the non-compliance continued. She held the paper in trembling hands, the words blurring through her tears. For the first time, she wondered if she could keep her home. The thought of losing the place she had fought so hard to provide for her children cut deeper than any fine. It was no longer about toys in the yard, it was about survival. News of the new fine reached Evelyn, who wasted no time rallying others. That evening, she hosted a quiet gathering in her living room. Parents arrived with determined faces, carrying stories of their own grievances. One had been fined for planting flowers not listed in the approved guidelines. Another had been warned for leaving holiday decorations up 2 days past the deadline. Together, they realized that Rachel's case was not an isolated injustice, but a symptom of a much larger problem. "We can't let this stand," one father said, his voice low but firm. "If they can do this to her, they can do this to any of us." The group began to strategize. Some suggested writing a petition demanding that the fines be overturned. Others proposed attending the next HOA meeting en masse to voice their opposition. For the first time in years, the community felt united against the very authority that claimed to represent them. Rachel learned of the gathering only afterward, when Evelyn stopped by with a reassuring smile. Though still cautious, Rachel felt a spark of hope ignite within her. Perhaps she was not as alone as she had feared. The idea that her neighbors were willing to stand beside her filled her with a renewed strength. But the HOA was not blind to the growing unrest. Rumors of secret meetings reached Whitfield's ears, and her resolve hardened. She saw the pushback not as a call for fairness, but as a rebellion to be crushed. To her, Rachel was no longer just a homeowner out of compliance. She was a symbol of defiance, and symbols needed to be broken. The tension escalated further when Rachel found a formal summons taped to her door. The HOA was taking her to small claims court for unpaid fines. The paper felt heavier than its weight. A document that carried both threat and finality. She sank onto the porch steps, the world spinning around her. How had toys in the yard spiraled into legal action? Word of the summons spread quickly through the neighborhood, igniting outrage among those already on edge. The idea that a single mother could face court over children's toys felt grotesque, like a punishment stripped of reason. Neighbors who had never spoken up before now approached Rachel, offering words of support. Some even pledged to attend the hearing in solidarity, determined to make their voices heard. For Rachel, the days leading up to the court date blurred into a haze of anxiety and preparation. She could not afford a lawyer, but Evelyn helped her, gathered documents and photographs, evidence that the toys had posed no harm and that the HOA's actions were driven more by obsession than reason. Rachel practiced explaining her side, though her voice wavered under the weight of fear. And yet, amidst the fear, a strange resilience began to bloom. Her children still laughed in the yard, unaware of the storm, and their innocence became her anchor. The community, once fractured, now stood like a shield around her. For the first time in months, she felt the faint stirrings of hope. Hope that perhaps the fight would not be hers to carry alone. The morning of the court date arrived, the sky overcast as if mirroring the uncertainty that lay ahead. Rachel dressed. Carefully, her hands trembling as she held the summons one last time. Her neighbors gathered outside her house, a silent show of support, their presence both comforting and overwhelming. As she walked toward the courthouse with Evelyn at her side, Rachel realized that the battle had grown larger than her own struggle. It was about fairness, dignity, and the right of a community to live free of fear. And though the outcome was uncertain, she knew one thing for sure. The HOA had underestimated the power of unity. The doors of the courthouse loomed ahead, a threshold between despair and justice. And as Rachel stepped inside, the story of toys and fines was about to transform into something far greater. The gathering storm, the tension between the single mother, her children, and the HOA was no longer just a personal conflict. By now, it had become the heartbeat of the neighborhood. The air carried a different weight, heavy with whispers and concerned glances exchanged between neighbors. What began as a quiet act of defiance, children's toys remaining on the lawn, was growing into something much larger, something that threatened to shake the very foundation of the HOA's power. The HOA board, frustrated that their fines and letters had not bent the mother to their will, began stepping up their tactics. Notices were sent out with bold red stamps demanding immediate payment. They claimed the toys represented hazards, that they lowered property values, and that rules applied equally to all residents. The language in their letters grew harsher, almost hostile, filled with threats of legal action and escalating penalties. But the community had seen enough. They were no longer convinced this was about safety or rules. To them, it was about cruelty disguised as regulation. They knew this mother was juggling work, childcare, and financial strain. Instead of empathy, the HOA had chosen to prey on her circumstances. The first sign of organized resistance appeared one Saturday morning. A neighbor, an older woman who had lived in the community for decades, placed a hand-painted sign in her front yard. In bold letters it read, "Let the kids play." It was a simple gesture, but it lit a spark. Within days, other signs appeared on lawns across the neighborhood. "Support our neighbor. Toys are not a crime. Community over HOA." The HOA board was stunned. They had long ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, confident that fear of fines and legal threats would keep residents obedient. But this was different. For the first time, the people were not only questioning their authority, but actively rebelling against it. Meetings that once took place in the HOA's carefully controlled clubhouse were now spilling onto driveways and front porches. Neighbors, who rarely spoke to one another, gathered in small groups, united by shared outrage. Stories poured out. Others, too, had been fined unfairly or humiliated by the board's arbitrary enforcement of rules. A retired veteran recalled how he had once been cited for hanging an American flag in the wrong position. Another family revealed they had been forced to repaint their house twice in a single year because the board claimed their color choice violated aesthetic harmony. It became clear this wasn't just about one mother or her children's toys. It was about years of pent-up frustration, an HOA that had grown too powerful, and a community that had been silenced for too long. The mother, though overwhelmed, found herself at the center of this movement. She hadn't asked to be a leader, but the community saw her struggle as a symbol of everything they resented. One evening, as she stood on her porch watching neighbors plant supportive signs on their lawns, she realized something profound. She was no longer fighting this battle alone, but the HOA board was not ready to surrender. Behind closed doors, they planned their counterattack. They began drafting letters to local authorities, portraying the mother and her supporters as disruptive. They accused the community of staging illegal gatherings and warned of consequences for anyone involved. In the protests, the board hoped to intimidate residents into backing down, but instead their threats only fueled the growing resistance. By midweek, the neighborhood felt like two opposing camps. On one side, the HOA and its shrinking circle of loyal supporters. On the other, a swelling majority of residents rallying behind the mother. Driveways were filled with chalk drawings from children, messages like, "We belong here and play is not a crime." Adults waved to one another with newfound camaraderie, forming bonds over their shared defiance. The local press began to take notice. A small community paper ran a story titled, "HOA targets single mom over toys, neighbors rally." The article described the conflict in detail, capturing the community's passion and the board's inflexibility. Soon after, larger media outlets picked up the story. Reporters came with cameras, eager to capture images of toys on the lawn, protest signs, and residents standing shoulder to shoulder. The HOA despised this attention. Their carefully curated image of order and prestige was unraveling in front of the world. But instead of de-escalating, they doubled down. The board issued another fine, this time an outrageous amount, and declared the mother in violation of community harmony. The move backfired spectacularly. Outrage spilled across social media as the story went viral. People from other states, even other countries, began weighing in, condemning the HOA's actions. Comments flooded online platforms. "Unbelievable! They should be ashamed. This is why HOAs have such a bad reputation." The pressure on the HOA grew unbearable. Their inboxes were overwhelmed with angry emails. Phone calls poured in from strangers demanding justice for the mother. What had begun as a quiet neighborhood dispute had transformed into a national conversation about power, fairness, and community. Yet even as support for the mother grew, she worried about the toll it was taking on her children. They could sense the tension, the way adults whispered when they passed by the cameras on the street. She wanted nothing more than to shield them, to give them the simple joy of playing without worry. But she also knew that this fight, as exhausting as it was, had become bigger than her own family. And so, the neighborhood continued to march forward, united in defiance, even as the HOA clung desperately to its authority. But the storm was only beginning. The HOA had one final card to play, one last attempt to crush the rebellion and reassert control. And when they played it, the battle would escalate into something far more serious than anyone had imagined. The weeks following the community's petition marked a turning point in the struggle between the HOA board and the residents. For the single mother at the center of it all, the days were filled with a mix of relief and tension. Relief, because she was no longer alone. Tension, because the HOA refused to back down. The fines kept coming, each letter more aggressive than the last, filled with threats of legal action, property liens, and possible eviction if she continued to defy their rules. The board seemed determined to make an example out of her. And yet every time the HOA pushed harder, the community's resolve grew stronger. Neighbors who had once remained neutral now stepped forward, unwilling to watch injustice unfold right outside their doors. Retirees, young families, and even those who had never interacted much with the single mom began to see her struggle as their own. The unfairness cut deeper than a few scattered toys. It became a symbol of something larger, the question of whether a neighborhood belonged to its residents or to a handful of people drunk on authority. By now, the story had spread beyond the small cluster of houses. A local journalist picked it up after seeing the online petition, which had gathered hundreds of signatures not only from the neighborhood, but also from supporters across the town. The article painted a vivid picture of a mother harassed for letting her children play freely, while a board of power-hungry officials clung to arbitrary rules. The piece went viral within the town's social media circles. People shared it with outrage, tagging friends and demanding justice. That visibility was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it amplified the mother's cause. On the other, it provoked the HOA into doubling down. At their next board meeting, they called the growing public support misinformation and accused the residents of defaming them. They announced a special assessment fee to cover the HOA's legal expenses in defending the community's image. The move infuriated homeowners who had no desire to bankroll the board's vendetta. For many, this was the final straw. Tension boiled over when a resident discovered that the board had authorized towing of cars belonging to anyone refusing to pay fines. Several vehicles were removed overnight, sparking chaos. People woke up to find their cars missing, while the HOA smugly explained that it was within their rights, as outlined in the bylaws. Furious homeowners confronted board members in driveways, voices raised, anger spilling into the streets. Police were called to de-escalate, but even they seemed hesitant, caught between enforcing civil agreements and witnessing what was beginning to look like harassment. In the midst of this, the single mother tried to remain strong for her children. She put on a brave face, but inside she carried an ache of exhaustion. Each day felt like a battle, and although her neighbors had rallied around her, the weight of being the target never eased. Her children noticed her stress, sensing the unease that lingered in every corner of their home. The toys that had once brought laughter now carried a strange heaviness, symbols of the storm raging outside their little house. And yet, it was those same toys that kept her moving forward. Every time she considered giving in, she would see her children playing, their innocence untouched by the petty wars of adults. She reminded herself that their joy was worth fighting for, that their right to grow up free and unafraid mattered more than appeasing a board obsessed with control. The community, too, began to realize that this fight wasn't only about toys. It was about dignity, about freedom, about reclaiming their neighborhood from the grip of authoritarian rule. They organized another meeting, this time not in someone's backyard, but in the local community center, a public space that the HOA couldn't control. Nearly every resident showed up. The energy in the room was electric. Voices echoed with frustration, determination, and a shared belief that something had to change. One by one, residents spoke about their own experiences with the HOA. Stories poured out, accounts of harassment over garden choices, threats over holiday decorations, fines for minor infractions like trash cans left at the curb a few hours too long. As people listened, it became clear that the single mom's ordeal was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a culture of bullying that had gone unchecked for far too long. From that meeting emerged a plan. The neighbors would not only fight the fines, but also move to remove the current HOA board entirely. They researched their legal rights, combed through the bylaws, and reached out to attorneys willing to help pro bono. The petition that had started as a simple show of solidarity now evolved into a campaign for structural change. Flyers circulated through the neighborhood, social media groups buzzed with updates, and volunteers went door to door to gather support for a recall vote. The board sensed the rebellion brewing and tried to clamp down harder. They sent cease and desist letters, accused residents of spreading lies, and even threatened lawsuits. But the more they pushed, the more resistance grew. What had begun as one mother's struggle against unjust fines had transformed into a full-scale uprising. On a crisp morning, weeks after the first toy fines had arrived, the single mother stood outside her home and watched as neighbors gathered around her front yard. They carried signs that read, "Let kids be kids, our community, our rules, and end HOA abuse." The demonstration wasn't just symbolic. It was a message to the board that the residents were done being silent. Local reporters arrived, cameras flashing, microphones raised to capture the voices of a community fed up with being bullied. The board members watched from a distance, their faces pale and tight with anger. They had expected compliance, submission, perhaps a few quiet grumbles. What they faced instead was unity. A neighborhood, once divided by fear and indifference, had found its strength in shared resistance. The storm had gathered, and it was no longer contained. The HOA had unleashed a fight they were never prepared to handle, and as the single mother stood among her neighbors, hearing chants rise and seeing the fire in their eyes, she realized something important. This was no longer just her fight. It was theirs. Together, they were unstoppable. The next step would not just decide the fate of a few toys on a lawn, it would decide the future of the entire neighborhood. A victory. Etched in memory, the day after the verdict, the neighborhood felt different. The air was fresher, the street seemed brighter, and laughter echoed more freely than it had in months. For the single mother at the heart of the battle, it was as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. No longer would she wake each morning with the dread of another threatening letter, another fine or another knock at the door meant to break her spirit. The ruling had not only freed her from the financial burden unfairly placed upon her, but it had also validated her struggle. She had fought, and she had won. The toys that once sparked conflict now stood as symbols of resilience. Small bicycles leaned proudly against the porch railing. A jump rope lay across the lawn, half forgotten after an afternoon of play. Even the tiny chalk drawings on the pavement, faded by the weather yet still visible, seemed like quiet, testaments to a childhood preserved against unreasonable odds. The very objects that the HOA once labeled as clutter had become emblems of joy and victory, shared not just by the mother and her children, but by an entire community. The neighbors, too, felt the triumph deeply. They had stood together, resisting intimidation and fines, and had proven that collective strength could dismantle even the harshest injustices. Conversations blossomed across the fences and sidewalks. People waved more warmly, smiled more often, and gathered outside in small groups to talk about what had just unfolded. What had begun as one family's hardship had evolved into a movement of solidarity, one that reminded everyone of the simple truth. Rules should never overshadow humanity. The HOA board, meanwhile, retreated into silence. Once confident in their authority, they now found themselves scrutinized and weakened. Members who had voted in favor of the fines now avoided public appearances, embarrassed by the backlash. Others quietly resigned, unwilling to face the anger of neighbors who no longer trusted them. In the wake of the court's decision, the HOA had been forced to step back and reconsider its purpose. It was no longer a body that wielded unchecked power, but a group held accountable by those it was meant to serve. The story quickly spread beyond the neighborhood. Local news stations aired segments, complete with footage of the courtroom celebrations. Newspapers ran headlines that framed the single mother as a symbol of courage and determination. Online, the story took on a life of its own, shared across social media platforms where thousands commented, expressing outrage at the HOA's behavior and admiration for the mother's bravery. The narrative resonated with countless people who had faced similar struggles in their own communities. It wasn't just about toys in a yard. It was about fairness, compassion, and the universal right to raise a family without unnecessary oppression. For the children, life finally felt normal again. They no longer worried about their playthings being taken away or their mother's tears after opening a fine notice. Their days were once again filled with the simple joys of being young, racing scooters down the driveway, playing hide-and-seek under the oak tree, and building forts with their friends. Each laugh they shared, each moment of carefree play was a victory in itself, proof that their world had been restored. The single mother often found herself standing on her porch, watching her children play, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knew that she had not won this battle alone. The community had stood by her, neighbors had raised their voices, and strangers had offered words of encouragement when she needed them most. It was a reminder that while injustice could isolate a person, unity could bring them back into the light. She also knew that this victory carried lessons. The experience had revealed the importance of vigilance, of questioning authority when it acted without compassion. It had shown her children that standing up for what was right was never easy, but it was always worthwhile. It had taught her neighbors that silence in the face of unfairness could be as damaging as the unfairness itself. And most importantly, it had underscored the truth that rules, when applied without empathy, lose their legitimacy. As weeks turned into months, the story remained alive in the community. Annual gatherings began to include mentions of the struggle, not as a bitter memory, but as a tale of triumph. New families who moved into the neighborhood heard the story from their neighbors and felt reassured that this was a place where people cared for one another. The single mother's home became more than just a house. It was a symbol, a reminder of what could be achieved when ordinary people refused to bow to injustice. The HOA never again attempted to fine families for toys left outside. Instead, new policies were drafted, ones that reflected a balance between maintaining order and respecting the needs of families. While not everyone trusted the board, the very fact that such changes were made showed that the victory had lasting effects. It wasn't just about one case, but about reshaping an entire approach to governance in the neighborhood. The single mother, though, never sought fame or recognition. For her, the victory was personal. It was about her children's right to enjoy their childhood without unnecessary fear. It was about her right to raise them with dignity. And while the world might remember her as a fighter who took on the HOA and won, she remembered it simply as the time she protected her family and her home. On one quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and painted the sky with hues of orange and pink, the mother sat outside with her children. Their laughter mingled with the chirping of crickets, and for the first time in a long while, she felt complete peace. She knew challenges would come again, as they always do in life, but she also knew she was no longer alone. The strength of her neighbors, the wisdom of her struggle, and the resilience of her spirit would carry her forward, and so the story of a single mother, her children's toys, and an overreaching HOA became more than a local drama. It became a lesson etched into the hearts of many, a reminder that no rule is stronger than the bond of community, and no injustice can withstand the collective will of people determined to do what is right. It ended not with bitterness, but with laughter, on a lawn filled with toys, proof that childhood had prevailed, and justice had found its rightful place.